I recall one winter, it was over 30 years ago, when I was still a young man living in a small town in the mountains of Vermont. The snow fell relentlessly for 3 days straight, a blinding white shroud that buried everything. Power lines snapped like dry twigs, roads vanished beneath drifts taller than a man, and the cold, it pierced to the bone, no matter how many layers you wore. People huddled together, rationed supplies, and worried. But I remember my grandfather, a man of the woods, telling me, "The real struggle, son, isn't ours. It's for those out there, with no roof, no fire. They fight for every breath." His words, simple as they were, stayed with me, a quiet reminder of nature's cruel, indifferent majesty, and the pure, unyielding will to survive that some creatures possess. A will that often surpasses our own. It's a harsh truth, often lost on those of us tucked away in warm homes, but in the vast, frozen wilderness, that truth defines every moment. In the heart of the Carpathian peaks, where ancient forests clutched at the sky and winter reigned supreme for more than half the year, Marek Volkov carved out his existence. His cabin, a rough-hewn structure of pine and stone, nestled in a small, sheltered valley, a tiny speck against the monumental backdrop of snow-laden peaks. For 2 decades, this was his world, a deliberate choice made after the clamor of the modern world and personal loss drove him from the valleys below. Once a forest ranger, a man of rules and regulations, here the only laws were those of the wild: survive, adapt, live. Marek was 58, though the rugged life had etched lines on his face that suggested more years. His lean, sinewy frame belied a surprising strength, honed by countless hours of felling trees, chopping firewood, and navigating treacherous terrain. He moved with the quiet, almost predatory grace of a creature utterly at home in its environment, his heavy, weathered leather boots crunching softly in the snow. His ice-blue eyes, set deep beneath furrowed brows, missed nothing, scanning the forest with a calm, knowing depth that spoke of countless sunrises and sunsets witnessed from these isolated heights. A thick, gray beard, often untrimmed, framed a prominent nose and high cheekbones, giving him the look of an ancient mountain spirit. He smelled of campfire smoke, pine resin, and damp earth, a scent as much a part of him as his patched woolen anorak and sturdy canvas trousers. His days unfolded with a methodical rhythm, each task essential, each moment a testament to his self-sufficiency. In this demanding routine, there was a certain peace, a quiet dignity in facing the harsh, untamed elements day after relentless day. The morning began deceptively clear, but by midday, a whiteout blizzard descended on the peaks with the sudden, savage force of a wild beast. The wind howled like a banshee's wail through the pines, whipping snow into a blinding frenzy that reduced visibility to mere feet. Marek, ever vigilant, set out on his routine patrol for firewood, venturing deeper into the forest than usual, his axe heavy in his gloved hand. The need for fuel was a constant, primal demand in this frozen world, and he knew the best fallen timber lay in sheltered ravines. He navigated by instinct, relying on subtle shifts in the wind and the contours of the terrain he knew intimately, when something caught his eye, a darker shape against the swirling whiteness, an anomaly in the monotonous snowscape. He approached cautiously, his breath clouding in the frigid air, the biting wind tearing at his fur hat. What he found stopped him in his tracks, a knot forming in his gut. It was a lynx, young, scarcely more than a kitten, half buried in a snowdrift beneath the skeletal branches of a spruce. Her tawny gray fur, usually so vibrant, was matted with ice and snow, dull and lifeless. A faint, wispy mist escaped her nostrils with each shallow, labored breath, a fragile whisper of life against the encroaching cold of death. Her amber eyes, wide open, were clouded, reflecting only the cold, indifferent sky. One foreleg was bent at an unnatural angle, likely from a fall or a struggle, a dark, frozen stain of blood visible in the snow beneath her.
a creature of pure wilderness, a silent hunter of these very peaks, brought low, utterly helpless by the merciless elements. This was Lyra, though he didn't know her name then, only that she was fading, a precious ember on the verge of extinction. Marek stood for a long moment, the blizzard raging around him, the decision weighing heavily on his chest. His rational mind, the part that had survived decades in this brutal environment, screamed caution. A wild animal, injured and frightened, could lash out. He could be hurt, could succumb to hypothermia himself, leaving his cabin empty, his own life at risk. Yet something else stirred within him, an instinct deeper than reason, a profound, unyielding compassion for this small, suffering life. He saw not a predator, but a vulnerable creature, a spark of the wild on the brink of vanishing. Without further hesitation, he dropped his axe into the snow, its dull thud swallowed by the storm. He knelt, slowly, deliberately, extending a gloved hand, speaking in a low, soothing murmur that the wind tried to steal. The lynx, Lyra, barely responded, too weak, too far gone. Carefully, he lifted her heavy, limp body into his arms. The kitten was surprisingly weighty, a dead weight, yet also fragile, her small form rigid with cold. The journey back was a desperate, agonizing race against time, a battle with the elements that felt both personal and primal. The blinding snow lashed his face, stinging his eyes, while the piercing wind seemed to rip the warmth from his very bones. Each step was a gamble, his legs sinking deep into fresh drifts, threatening to buckle under the combined weight of the lynx and his own exhausted body. His lungs burned from the icy air, each breath a struggle, a gasp for oxygen that felt thin and insufficient. He sensed the insidious creep of hypothermia, the numbness in his fingers and toes, the shudder racking his frame. But the faint, almost imperceptible spark of life he felt in the lynx's fading gaze, that desperate, wild plea to exist, drove him forward. It was a silent promise he felt compelled to keep. He stumbled, recovered, pressed on, the thought of his cabin's faint, distant light, a beacon of hope in the swirling chaos, guiding him through the ordeal. He didn't think of the foolishness of his actions, nor the danger. There was only urgency, a desperate need to reach warmth, to breathe life back into this dying creature. He pushed through drifts that reached his waist, his muscles screaming with strain. His mind focused solely on the rhythmic crunch of his boots and the precious, fragile burden in his arms. He wasn't carrying just a lynx, he was carrying a piece of the wild itself, a fragment of the mountain's soul that he refused to let perish. No, the wild wasn't always about the survival of the fittest, not entirely. Sometimes it was about something far deeper. The final yards to the cabin were a blur of agony and instinct. Marek stumbled through the threshold, the lynx a dead weight in his arms, and collapsed onto the rough-hewn floor, the storm's fury momentarily held at bay by the thick wooden door he barely managed to kick shut. His body screamed in protest, a violent shiver seizing him, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the frigid air burning his lungs, the taste of snow and fear on his tongue. But the urgency of the small life in his arms jolted him back. With immense effort, he pushed himself up, his muscles stiff and protesting.
The cabin was a single, dim room, dominated by a stone hearth where embers still glowed faintly. He carefully laid the lynx on a pile of old furs near the dying fire, her small body rigid with cold. His hands, clumsy with numbness, fumbled for kindling and dry wood. Soon, flames danced, casting flickering shadows across the room, chasing away the oppressive chill. He peeled off his soaked outer layers, his skin a mottled blue, and wrapped himself in a thick, dry wool blanket, still shivering violently. His priority, however, remained the lynx. He gently unwrapped the fur bundle he'd used to shield her, revealing her small, still form.
Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. He began to rub her fur, slowly, gently, trying to coax warmth back into her. He recalled an old mountain trick for frostbite. Never use direct heat, just gentle friction and time. He boiled snow in a small pot, creating a weak, warm broth from dried venison, a precious commodity. He dipped a finger in and dabbed it on the lynx's tongue, then on her gums. For what felt like an eternity, there was no response. Despair, cold and sharp, began to prick at his resolve. Had he risked his life for nothing? Then a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch of an ear. A shallow gasp slightly deeper than the last. He continued his ministrations, his voice a low, steady murmur, a sound he hadn't used in years. He wasn't talking to the lynx, not really, but to the life within her, coaxing it, pleading with it to hold on. Hours passed. The storm howled outside, a relentless symphony of wind and ice. But inside, a fragile battle was being fought, one breath at a time. By dawn, the lynx's eyes had lost some of their glassy dullness, and a faint, rhythmic purr, barely audible, vibrated in her chest. She was still desperately weak, but she was alive. Marek, utterly spent, finally allowed himself to slump against the wall, watching the small spotted form, a profound, weary relief washing over him. The next few days were a delicate dance between fear and trust. Lyra, as Marek had begun to call her in his thoughts, a name that echoed the constellations, a distant, wild beauty, was still in critical condition. Her broken foreleg was a particular concern. Marek, drawing on forgotten knowledge from his ranger days and a lifetime of observing injured animals, fashioned a crude splint from thin strips of bark and leather, binding it gently but firmly. The lynx hissed, a low, guttural sound, her amber eyes blazing with pain and fear, but she was too weak to resist effectively. He spoke to her constantly, soft, soothing words, even as she tried to bat at his hands with a weak, unsheathed claw. He knew the line he walked. One wrong move, one sudden fright, and her wild instincts could overwhelm her. Feeding her was another challenge. She refused the venison broth, the smell of cooked meat alien to her. Marek resorted to raw scraps of dried deer meat, painstakingly rehydrated, offering them on a stick, then directly from his hand. It took days of patient coaxing, of leaving the meat within her reach, of ignoring her snarls and retreating glares, before she finally, hesitantly, took a piece. Each small victory was a monumental step. He cleaned her wounds with melted snow and herbs, his touch as light as a feather, his presence a constant, reassuring hum in the small cabin. Slowly, painstakingly, Lyra began to heal. Her fur, once matted and dull, regained its sleekness, the distinct black spots on her legs and belly becoming more pronounced. Her eyes, initially wide with terror, gradually softened, becoming watchful and curious rather than purely defensive. She still regarded Marek with the wary suspicion of a wild creature, but the raw fear began to recede, replaced by a grudging acceptance. She learned to associate his presence with warmth, food, and the easing of pain. He would sit for hours by the fire, reading his worn books or carving small wooden figures, while Lyra, at first hidden under a pile of furs, would eventually emerge, watching him with an intense, unblinking gaze. As weeks turned into a month, Lyra's strength returned with astonishing speed. The splint came off, and though she favored her leg for a while, she soon moved with a quiet, limber grace, testing her recovering limb. The cabin, once Marek's solitary sanctuary, was now shared. Lyra roamed freely, exploring every corner, batting at dangling threads, and occasionally, to Marek's quiet amusement, attempting to hunt a stray mouse that had dared to venture inside. She would often settle near the hearth, close to Marek, her soft purr a constant, comforting presence in the otherwise silent cabin. Their bond was a tapestry woven from shared survival, silent understanding, and an extraordinary mutual respect. Marek spoke to her less now.
their communication becoming a language of subtle glances, gentle gestures, and an almost telepathic awareness of each other's moods. He shared his meals, often leaving the choicest cuts of venison for her, his own diet becoming even more Spartan. He built a small raised platform near the window for her, where she would sit for hours, watching the snowfall, her senses keenly attuned to the world outside, a world she was still too vulnerable to rejoin. Marek knew, with a heavy heart, that this arrangement could not last forever. Lyra was a creature of the wild, and the cabin, however warm and safe, was a cage. But the Carpathian winter still held the mountains in its icy grip, and Lyra, though recovered, was not yet ready to face its brutal challenges alone. Her broken leg had healed, but her hunting skills, dulled by weeks of convalescence, needed honing. He would take her out into the woods, just beyond the cabin, on a long makeshift leash, letting her stalk small prey, testing her instincts. She would return to the cabin with him, a silent agreement, a shared secret. The secret, however, weighed heavily on Marek. He knew the mountains were not empty. He had seen the signs, heard the whispers on the wind. Poachers. Ruthless men who saw only profit in the magnificent creatures of the wild. To them, a lynx, especially one so healthy and accustomed to human presence, would be an irresistible prize, for its fur, for the illicit exotic pet trade, or simply as a trophy. The thought sent a cold dread through him. He had risked everything for Lyra. He would not let her fall into such hands. His vigilance, always keen, sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. He changed his routines, varying his paths for firewood, checking his traps more frequently, though he no longer set them for anything larger than rabbits. He started finding crude snares, not his own, in the deeper woods, near the game trails he knew so well. They were clumsy, amateurish, but effective enough to catch a deer, or worse, a lynx. He dismantled them, leaving no trace, his jaw set. Then came the distant shots, echoing through the valleys like cracks of thunder on a clear day. They were sporadic at first, then more frequent, signaling an increased presence of hunters, legal or otherwise. He spotted unfamiliar tracks near his territory, not the heavy, deliberate prints of the local forest patrol, but lighter, more furtive ones, sometimes accompanied by the distinct tread of snowshoes. The dark shadow of human greed was creeping closer, threatening to engulf the pristine wilderness he had chosen as his sanctuary. He felt a growing sense of unease, a tightening in his chest. His unique companion, his shared secret, was in grave danger. He began to consider the unthinkable, releasing Lyra before she was fully ready, hoping her wild instincts would guide her to safety, away from the encroaching threat. But the thought of her struggling, alone, in the vast, unforgiving winter, tore at his heart. One morning, a new, more brutal ice storm descended upon the Carpathians. It was unlike anything Marek had seen in years. Not just snow, but freezing rain that coated every surface in a treacherous, glittering sheath of ice. Trees groaned and snapped under the weight, sending terrifying cracks echoing through the valley. The cabin, usually so resilient, began to creak and protest. The constant drain on his firewood supply was unsustainable, and his small store of kerosene for his lamp was dangerously low. He needed essential supplies, flour, salt, more lamp oil, from the nearest outpost, a small trading post known as Orava's Stand, nestled in a lower valley, a treacherous day's journey away. It was a decision born of desperation. To leave Lyra, even for a day, felt like a betrayal. But to stay, risking running out of heat and light in such a storm, was to endanger them both. He prepared the cabin as best he could, banking the fire high, leaving a large pile of raw venison for Lyra, and securing the windows and door. He spoke to her, his voice low and urgent, explaining his departure, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. She watched him with her intelligent amber eyes, a faint rumble in her chest, a mix of unease and trust. As he stepped out into the biting wind and treacherous ice, his heart was a leaden weight in his chest, a knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. Every step on the ice-slicked path was a gamble, a slide away from a broken bone or worse. He moved with extreme caution, his axe serving as a precarious walking stick, his eyes scanning the treacherous landscape, not just for hazards, but for any sign of unwelcome human presence. The journey was a slow, agonizing crawl, each footfall a test of balance and nerve. While Marek battled the elements on his perilous journey, the same brutal ice storm forced another group of men to seek shelter.
Victor, the grizzled leader, and his two companions, Yevgen and Bogdan, were deep in the forest, tracking a particularly large stag they had wounded the day before. The storm had erased their tracks, and the ice made the pursuit impossible. They were cold, hungry, and frustrated, their hunting rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces grim under their fur hats. Victor, a man whose life had been spent navigating the Carpathians, knew this storm was no joke. They needed shelter, and fast. "There!" Yevgen shouted, pointing a gloved hand through the swirling snow and ice. A wisp of smoke, barely visible, curled from a distant chimney. An isolated cabin. It was known to them, vaguely, as the dwelling of the hermit, a man who kept to himself. They had always avoided it, seeing no profit there and respecting the unwritten rules of mountain solitude. But now, necessity trumped custom. They made their way to the cabin, slipping and sliding on the icy ground. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the wind's shriek and the creaking of ice-laden trees. There was no sign of life, no tracks leading in or out, only a thin layer of fresh ice coating the door. "Looks empty," Bogdan grunted, raising his rifle butt to smash the ice from the latch. Victor nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter, a flicker of unease in his gut. Even hermits usually left a mark, a sign of recent presence. This felt too still. With a splintering crack, the frozen latch gave way, and the door swung inward, groaning on its icy hinges. A gust of wind and snow swirled into the small, warm space, momentarily obscuring their vision. They stepped inside, their heavy boots crunching on the stray snow that had blown in, their rifles still lowered, expecting an empty dwelling, perhaps a place to build a fire and rest. But the dwelling was not empty. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, the swirling snow cleared, and they froze. All three men, hardened by years of illicit hunting and the brutal realities of the wilderness, stood utterly still, their breath catching in their throats. Their rifles, which had been loosely held, dropped further, almost to their sides, forgotten. By the hearth, where the fire crackled merrily, sat Lyra. She was not snarling, not cowering, not attempting to flee. She was simply there, a vision of quiet majesty. Her tawny gray fur, now thick and luxurious, gleamed in the firelight, her black ear tufts standing tall and alert. Her amber eyes, intelligent and calm, were fixed on the intruders, completely unafraid, utterly devoid of the wild panic they expected from a creature of her kind. She looked at them with an ancient, knowing gaze, a silent challenge in her stillness. The scene was so profoundly, impossibly tranquil, so utterly at odds with their expectations that the poachers were struck dumb. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind outside, and the sudden, deafening silence of three men who had just walked into the impossible. The blizzard intensified, a malevolent force that seemed intent on erasing all traces of the world. Marek pushed through it, each step a deliberate act of will against the biting wind that tore at his clothes and the ice that formed instantly on his beard. The path to Arava's stand was usually a day's hike, but today it felt like a journey to another world. He thought of Lyra, alone in the cabin, and a fresh wave of anxiety tightened his chest. Had he left enough wood? Would the fire hold? Her amber eyes, so full of burgeoning trust, haunted him. He pictured her curled by the hearth, a vulnerable shadow in his absence, and cursed the storm that had forced this separation. He imagined the worst, the cabin compromised, the fire dying, Lyra exposed to the elements, or worse, to human predation. The thoughts spurred him on, his breath ragged, his muscles aching, his mind a desperate calculation of distance and time. Arava's stand was a cluster of 3 buildings, a general store, a small inn, and a blacksmith's forge, huddled against a rock face in a slightly more sheltered valley. When Marek finally stumbled into the general store, hours later than he'd anticipated, he was a ghost of a man, covered in rime, his hands stiff with cold. Old Alara, the store owner, a woman whose face was as craggy and wise as the mountains themselves, took one look at him and pushed a steaming mug of herb tea into his hands. "Rough one, Marek," she murmured, her eyes assessing his weary frame. He nodded, unable to speak, the warmth slowly spreading through his frozen fingers. The store was a haven of activity, other mountain folk seeking refuge, exchanging news and warnings about the storm. He bought his supplies, more than usual, driven by an unspoken urgency, and listened to the chatter. There were whispers of increased poaching activity in the higher elevations, men growing bolder, more desperate as winter tightened its grip. The news solidified the dread in his heart. He knew he had to get back, and quickly. But the storm showed no signs of abating, trapping him there for the night, a torturous wait filled with restless sleep and visions of a vulnerable Lynx. Back at the cabin, the poachers remained motionless, their collective breath held, their rifles still lowered. Yevgen, the youngest and most impetuous of the trio, felt a prickle of superstitious fear crawl up his spine. This wasn't natural. A wild lynx, a creature known for its elusive ferocity, sitting there, calm as a house cat in a human dwelling? It defied everything he knew about the wild. Bogdan, older and more pragmatic, narrowed his eyes, searching for a trick, a snare, anything to explain the impossible tableau. He'd seen plenty of captive animals, but never one that exuded such quiet, unburdened dignity. This wasn't a pet, it was a sovereign being, choosing to be there. Victor, however, felt a deeper, more unsettling tremor. His gaze, usually sharp and calculating, was fixed on the lynx's right foreleg. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scar, a thin line where fur had grown back slightly differently, just above the paw. His mind, slow and deliberate, began to piece together fragments of memory, like shards of ice forming a pattern. Months ago, in the early grip of winter, his group had tracked a lynx, a young one, but already showing the promise of a magnificent pelt. They'd cornered it, shot it. He remembered the precise angle, the way it had fallen, broken, into a snowdrift. They hadn't bothered to retrieve it, the blizzard closing in, the risk not worth the effort for a wounded animal that would surely succumb to the elements. They had assumed it was dead, another ghost in the unforgiving mountains. Now, here she was, the same lynx, unmistakable, thriving. Not just alive, but seemingly at peace, an almost domestic tranquility radiating from her as she sat by the hearth, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. The scar on her leg, the very one they had inflicted, was irrefutable proof. Victor felt a cold shock, not of fear, but of profound, unadulterated awe. His grim purpose, the casual cruelty of his trade, seemed to evaporate, replaced by a gaping void of understanding. He had left her for dead, a broken thing, and this hermit, this silent man of the mountains, had not only saved her, but had brought her back to such vibrant life. It was an act of compassion so immense, so improbable, that it rendered him utterly speechless. He glanced at Yevgeny and Bogdan, whose faces mirrored his own stunned disbelief, their mouths slightly agape. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, a silent accusation, a testament to a miracle they had no right to witness. The cabin remained locked in that profound silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant shriek of the storm. The lynx, Lyra, continued to watch them, her gaze unwavering, not hostile, but deeply observant.
She seemed to understand their paralysis, their internal struggle. It was as if she, the rescued, was now the judge, her very presence a silent question. The minutes stretched, each one feeling like an hour, the tension a palpable force in the small space. Victor felt the weight of his rifle, suddenly heavy and meaningless in his hands. He, a man who had taken countless lives from these mountains, was disarmed not by force, but by a single, impossible image. He found himself unable to move, unable to speak, his mind reeling from the sheer audacity of what he was witnessing. Just then, a faint crunch of snow, followed by the scrape of an axe against the ice-laden path, reached their ears. Marek was returning. A fresh wave of dread, cold and sharp, pierced Marek's exhaustion as he approached his cabin. The door, which he had meticulously secured, was ajar, a sliver of darkness against the swirling white. Snow had drifted across the threshold, and a chilling draft flowed from within. His heart pounded, a drum against his ribs. He imagined the worst, a fallen tree, a broken window, or the all-too-familiar signs of intruders. His hand instinctively went to the axe at his belt, his grip tightening. He pushed the door open further, stepping inside, his eyes scanning the room, prepared for confrontation, for devastation. What he saw, however, was not what he expected. The three poachers stood frozen, their rifles still lowered, their faces a mixture of confusion, awe, and something akin to shame. And by the hearth, Lyra sat, calm and majestic, her amber eyes fixed not on him, but on them. The scene was utterly silent, a tableau of suspended animation. Marek's initial surge of anger and fear dissipated, replaced by a profound bewilderment. He looked from the poachers to Lyra, then back again, trying to decipher the impossible stillness. He saw the recognition in Victor's eyes, the dawning understanding that mirrored his own.
The Lynx was unharmed, thriving, and the men who had once sought her destruction were now rendered speechless by her mere presence. The air crackled with an unspoken narrative, a story more powerful than any words. Victor was the first to stir, though he still said nothing. His eyes, dark and narrowed, met Marek for a long, silent moment. There was no defiance, no threat, only a profound, unsettling understanding. Slowly, deliberately, Victor shifted his weight. Then, with a barely perceptible nod to his companions, he began to back away. Yevgen and Bogdan, still wide-eyed and silent, followed suit, their movements hesitant, almost respectful. They didn't turn their backs completely, but shuffled towards the open door, their weapons still lowered, forgotten. They stepped out into the biting storm, the door creaking shut behind them, leaving Marek and Lyra alone once more.